Welcome back to our study in the two letters Paul wrote to Timothy. We've been in the first letter, and in our last session we just started into chapter 5 and we did the first two verses as a study. We're going to read quite a large segment of scripture today because of the contextual setting. What the worst thing we can do with scripture many times is read it out of context or lift a verse out that we want to use to say something, and it's not saying that, or it's not saying it in the environment or the principle or the scriptural basis that we are trying to use it as. And so we're going to read 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 3 through 16 as one unit, and then we'll discuss in a summary discussion what that is basically telling us. Honor widows who are widows indeed, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in regard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. And at the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to Satan. If a woman who is a believer has dependent widows, let her assist them, and let not the church be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Well, there's a lot there, and we have to see it from the culture that Paul's writing to Timothy about, and that's the church at Ephesus, and probably those surrounding Asia Minor communities that we see even listed in, say, Revelation chapter 2 and 3. And of course, Paul talks about some of those communities too in his missionary journeys, going through even the region of Galatia, which would not be extremely far from where we're talking about. Well, there was often a mentality towards a woman whose husband died, and especially if she was an older woman, it was a weird thing because they kind of just discarded these older women. And Paul says they have a use. They should be people of prayer. They may not be able to get remarried, and may not be remarried, but they should be people of prayer, holding fast to that, above reproach. And he puts both of these categories of women in that area of trying to live a life above reproach, which means they can't be thrown into an identity of what the world would see. And he categorizes the widows as those above the age of 60 and those below the age of 60, which is kind of interesting because the average lifespan of a female during that period of time was under 65. So in fact, it was more likely under 60, but it varied depending on which part of the Roman Empire you lived in. And so Paul is talking to Timothy, and he's telling him to just be careful and to make sure that these ladies are covered. And he also addresses this aspect of other women ministering to these widows, so that the church is not overwhelmed with ministry to them. Because there's a lot of dangles that the church had to meet the needs of people's lives, not only spiritually, which was obviously the first and foremost, but also physically and socially, and to a certain extent culturally. So it's a very complex scenario, but the key thing is that the women stayed above reproach, and the younger girls who lost their husbands, he encourages them to get married so that they're not tempted by their sensualities and by the things of the world to live in polygamous lives, or to live just in fornication without being married. And so that is part of the principle he's addressing here. Again, it's a cultural picture that we can take the truth out of and apply to our lives. Obviously, the Lord does not want us living together in sexual relationships outside of marriage. Well, we'll pick up there in our next session.